Well, hello again. This is the third and final segment of this first major thing related to the two houses. In this one, we're going to be talking about the two chambers of the legislature or bicameral uniqueness. So let's get right into it, shall we? I'm going to zoom in so you can see, and we're going to dive right in, and we're going to talk about the objective for today. By the time we're finished, it is my hope that you'll be able to differentiate, which is a fancy $5 word for be able to compare and contrast between the Senate and the House of Representatives, reflecting on the nature of people who are, at least originally, the thought behind the nature of those who would be elected into these two different chambers, the character and the powers afforded to them, the powers that each of them have, which are different kind of powers and responsibilities. So we'll kind of talk about that. So the two chambers of Congress, again, are the House of Representatives and the Senate. So first, they have different powers. The House has these powers. They have the power to impeach the president and other officials and judges. Impeach is, again, a really fancy word for fire them, basically. Now they got to vote and they got to confirm that they want to impeach. And basically, by impeaching, they don't remove them from office, they raise charges against them to be heard. So they have the power to impeach. Um, so again, a peach is basically a criminal indictment, a criminal charge. So a formal charge or serious accusation of a crime, much like what the grand jury would do. The Senate, however, will decide whether or not these charges are legit. So for a president to be impeached, which has never happened, I mean, well, it has happened, but a president has never been removed from office. They've only ever been impeached. The first, the president has to be impeached, a charge has to be brought against that president, and then the Senate will convene to determine whether or not the charges are valid. And if they are determined to be valid, then a president or a federal judge will be removed from office. Now, while the first impeachment has occurred in the nation's history a couple of times, the Senate has never removed a president from office. That has never happened. The closest I think we ever came was Nixon, and he stepped out. He resigned his position before it really got any further. All right. They have the power to decide presidential election if there is not a clear winner in the general election. So if it gets too close to call, the House of Representatives will make a vote. Generally speaking, whoever's party has the um, has the authority in the House will probably win that election. And lastly, the House has probably its most important power, the power of the purse, or in other words, money, money, money. The House of Representatives has the power over money, which means that any bill that is brought into law has to be brought via the House. So the Senate cannot introduce a law that deals with money. They can deal anything else, and so can the House. But only the House can introduce a law that deals with money, taxes, or something of that nature. The House of Representatives deals with money. Now, there's a reason for this, which we'll talk about later. The Senate, however, has different powers. The Senate has the power to hold impeachment trials and convict, as we already discussed. The Senate has the power to ratify treaties, as already discussed. This requires a two-thirds majority vote in the Senate. Remember the difference between a treaty and a presidential, I almost want to say agreement, but the difference is when a presidential, um, not agreement, but I think it's not an agreement, when a presidential, I'll just say agreement for now until I come up with the right word, which I can't think of right now. The president only needs a majority vote from both chambers. But in order to get a treaty to pass, it must be done through a two-thirds majority vote, which is really hard because normally the Senate votes along party line, and very rarely does any party, Republican or Democrat, hold what's called a supermajority, or hold 2/3 of the majority in the Senate. So generally speaking, it's pretty close to 50-50. So it's really hard for a president to get that much support to pass a treaty. They really have to be in agreement. Um, that was trying to zoom in. So this is why on November 19th, 1919, after the conclusion of World War I, the Senate refused to sign the Treaty of Versailles in France. This was the first time the Senate's history that it refused to ratify a peace treaty. This was actually initiated by our president, Woodrow Wilson, who had come up with the idea of doing a League of Nations, which was um, basically like what we have today in the um, oh my the sorry, I'm having like a senior moment. Can I have those? I think I can. This this is much like what we've got today, and I almost want to say NATO, but that's not what I'm thinking of. Um, but the League of Nations was an agreement among the winning nations, obviously, of World War One, in which they would kind of work together and they would agree before they could go into war, and they would be able to agree on peace treaties and trade and all of that. And the Senate back home said, we don't want to be part of that. And the reason they didn't is because they believed it placed America's sovereignty in peril. Or, in other words, if they signed up to be a part of the League of Nations, what it would do is it means every time America wanted to do something internationally, it would actually have to ask for France's and England's permission. And the Senate said, Woodrow, that's a fantastic idea, except we're America and we don't want to ask anybody permission to do anything. So they decided to vote against it, which is why most of the time presidents do not prefer presidential treaties. They would rather have agreements instead of those. So, anyways, the power to confirm appointments of officials. The president has the ability to um, appoint judges and cabinet members, but just because he or she appoints such a person does not mean they get the job. In order for them to get the job, the Senate must confirm them, which means first the Senate has hearings in which they basically, it's a really long job interview, probably the most intimidating job interview in the history of job interviews, in which a person sits in front of the Senate hearing committee and gets grilled with questions, and they have to answer these questions. And then after this long process, which sometimes is held on television, then the Senate votes to determine whether or not they're going to confirm this appointment or not. And if they decide not to, then the president has to appoint somebody else until finally we get somebody to take the job. So they have those powers. So why are there two? Well, historically, as we have discussed in the past, the Congress battled between two plans, the New Jersey and the Virginia plan. They eventually reached a compromise which included both plans. So the historical is the Great Compromise. Plan one, between these two plans, it would be able to accommodate the smaller and larger states. Representation based upon population, the House of Representatives, representation evenly spread across the board, favoring smaller states, which is the Senate. Another reason is practical reasons. Interbranch checks. Two chambers divides the power among two different units, which means nobody's holding all the cards. In order for bills to pass, both chambers have to be in agreement, which is not always the easiest thing to do. So in a Republican government, James Madison said, legislative authority necessarily predominates. The remedy for this inconveniency is to divide the legislature into two different branches to render them different mode of election and different principles of action, as little connected with each other as the nature of their common functions and their common dependence on society will admit, which is a really fancy way, James Madison probably just saying that the best way to have a government that functions well and doesn't get abusive is to split the power between the two so that they have to work together, so that things that shouldn't be voted into law likely won't be voted into law, and only the things that there is a predominant agreement on will actually be voted into law. Why? Because they have to both work together. And as you probably know, if you've ever been on a sports team, that's not always the easiest thing. And it's the same thing here. Um, and then another reason is if you watch that crash course video, you'll have seen the clone zone. I really, really recommend you watch it. But there's another reason why there are two, and that deals with the nature and responsibility of each. The Senate, for instance, was considered originally to be more mature. Remember, they had to be older. So older and wiser, 30 was considered old back then, because remember, if you lived to be 50 in the late 1700s, early 1800s, you are really, really living on borrowed time. They were insulated. Since they were only reelected every 6 years, they were able to make the tougher, sometimes less popular decisions because they had like longer terms of office to exist in. So the idea being is people having short memories, if they made a tough decision early in their term, people may forget after 6 years, and you know that's true. We tend to forget things after 6 months, let alone 6 years. Deliberative, the ability to discuss and debate freely with less concern for immediate repercussions from the public, again, every 6 years being voted into office, which means they were able to deal with things a little bit differently. And then trustee, representative acting in the public's best interest in spite of them. Again, that's that whole idea of doing the less popular things sometimes, or that idea of saying, I know you don't like it now, but trust me, it's good for you. Eat your vegetables, that kind of an idea. The House, however, was considered to be more responsive, closer to their constituents with immediate consequences. They are voted in every 2 years, which means if they are irresponsible, if they make unpopular decisions, immediately they're going to feel the pain of that because they can be reelected or kicked out of office in 2 years. Because every 2 years they've got to run for reelection. Every 6 years for the Senate, but every 2 years. So you can see how that makes the House a lot more responsive to the public. They listen a lot more closely because they know that they're going to have to deal with a reelection cycle very soon, which is also why they were placed with the power of the purse, because they know they're going to have to be responsible to answer to the public for the decisions they make. They're the ones that make the decisions about the money. Because if they make an unpopular decision about money, they're going to have to answer for it immediately, which tends to make them a little bit more conservative about how we spend our money, knowing full well that people tend to remember how money is spent more than anything. So that's kind of the difference. More mature, insulated, deliberative, a trustee, and then the House much more responsive and deals with the money because of that. All right, that is the clone zone, and that is the conclusion of this particular unit. When we return, we are going to deal with the next unit, which is the powers of Congress. So I will see you when we return.